Well, thank you, Doug and Joe, and it's exciting for me to get to speak to Sharon and interview her on the air because, quite candidly, it's nice to have a biologist who specializes in molecular biology. But the thing I appreciate most about Sharon is her understanding of the Scripture, and her book starts out with a marvelous promise of hope. And I'm going to get right into the interview with her because I think it's critical, Doug, that people, number one, I love her title, Ebola and the Fourth Horseman of the Apocalypse, the Blood Serpent. And we're going to talk a lot about blood tonight because from Leviticus forward, the life is in the blood. Jesus obviously poured out his blood for our eternal redemption. And I'm going to get right into the interview with Sharon. Hi, Sharon.
Hi, Steve. How are you? By the way, I'm not by myself. My husband, Derek, is sitting in as well. So you've got two Gilberts for the price of one.
Well, that's terrific. Hey, Sharon, before we get into, what exactly is Ebola, here's a question I want to ask you because obviously you use the four horsemen of the apocalypse. What percent, I was just thinking this as I was praying before the show tonight, what percent, and this is based on your interaction with the people around you, I'm talking about believers, what percent of them do you believe really take the book of Revelation literally as the prophetic picture of the end of days? If I were to ask myself that question, I don't know that I'd have an answer, so I'm going to give you a tough one right out of the gate, and then we'll get into the questions on the book and, go from there. Because I'm curious, okay? I'm curious because of what you write on, what you talk on, your background in obviously molecular biology. What percentage would you guess?
If you're talking about percentage of Bible-believing Christians, is that the question you're asking me?
Yes.
I'd say very small because many Bible-believing Christians in churches today, they hardly know the book of Revelation exists.
And of those that do know it exists, what percent do you think take it literally and understand it's a revelation of Jesus more than just a revelation of end-time events?
Exactly. I'd say that number is really small. And Derek kind of keeps track of the Pew surveys that are out there, and also what's the other one? It's the Christian survey.
George Barna of the Barna Research Group has been tracking this, and the percentage of people who self-identify as Bible-believing Christians is very small. I think only 19% of those who self-identify as Bible-believing, born-again Christians have a biblical worldview as defined by George Barna, which means believing in just the core tenets of the faith. I mean, forget about taking Revelation literally. Only 20% of people who claim to be born-again Christians believe that Jesus lived a sinless life, that you can't earn your way into heaven by doing good works, and that Satan is a literal entity.
Well, that's compelling. That's astounding, but more than anything, it's heartbreaking, especially, Derek, when the word of the Lord is, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeded out of the mouth of God. And I think the dismissal of God's word is so, we're going to talk about pandemic, but the sickness is in the pulpits which carrying through. So if I had to put what you just said, Derek, and Sharon kind of inferring, I would bet that of the professing people that you just basically defined by Barna's polls, the point is it'd have to be probably sub 1%. Is that pretty fair?
I think that's probably about right. If you get 5%, it would really surprise me.
Now, let's go right into the book, and again, you guys, just interrupt each other as you see fit because we're going to cover a lot of ground, ladies and gentlemen, tonight. And now let's explain to people what is Ebola and why do you call it a blood serpent? Obviously, great title. You've got the the electron photomicrograph on the cover of your book. Go ahead and take it.
Well, Steve, before I get into that, I just have to tell you how jazzed Derek and I are to get to talk with you on Hagman and Hagman. We started listening to you from our little bunker in St. Louis probably 15 years ago, and you were instrumental in getting us to start our podcast. We were really inspired by your passion, your dedication to preaching the gospel of Jesus Christ, your fearless, a day after day. I mean, you were on every day back then. And I don't know how you did it, but because of you and because of the Hagmans, I mean, we followed the Hagmans early on and so excited to see all the reports that Doug was giving us. And then when Joe came in and the two of you started doing the podcasting together, we were really excited. And we got to meet you guys in Orlando.
And that was one of the funniest things that happened that weekend. And I have to tell you this, I'm an old radio guy. I started radio broadcasting when I was still in college. So I began a professional broadcasting career in secular radio in 1980, and I was in the broadcasting industry for about 15 years. But I had the opportunity when I went back into talk radio in 2006, because the early part of my career was in music radio, I had the opportunity to bring Doug onto a secular station in mid-Missouri, one of those mainline, mainstream, conservative talk radio stations with the typical lineup that you'd expect. And then in the middle of the afternoon, this little 2-hour segment where I got to bring people in like Tom Horn and Patty Heron, a man we dearly miss,
Peter Levenda,
Russ Dizdar, give them an opportunity to be on secular radio. And so when we had the opportunity to meet you, Doug, and Joe in Orlando, we were like, oh, this is so cool.
And
the funny thing was when you came up to us and said, oh, the Gilberts, this is so cool. It's like, wow. It blew our mind.
And then Steve, we saw you when we were in Pikes Peak, but I can't recall. Did we get to actually meet you?
No, I wasn't there, and up until the time we had the Bozeman seminar, I don't travel because it's a bunch of reasons. Tom has tried to twist my arm to speak at those, but the main one being is that I can address so many more people worldwide. And I believe that the admonition in the Scripture to redeem the time, for the days are evil, I think that carries through. So I don't get to enjoy the fellowship, although when we had Doug here in Bozeman, Montana, and we had Pastor David Langford and Greg Evenson and John Kyle, and we had a marvelous time here, and I think it was close to 500 people. But Derek, the cool thing in that whole thing, you probably heard about it, the Spirit of the living God moved on the people, and over 100 people came forth to be baptized in water. So it was so spontaneous. It was very powerful. Pastor John Kyle, a lot of people, a lot of bondage got free, and I got to meet people. This is wild. I got to meet people that have been listening to me for 25 years, and actually I have to ask the listeners, Derek, when I went on talk radio, for some reason, I don't remember, but the point being, I know now, but the point being, it was so neat to meet people. So I share in the joy that you guys got to, experience with Doug, and Joe in Orlando. So I'm looking forward to meeting with you. But tonight I'm excited. I'm just excited because I think there are pivotal points in broadcasting, and I believe this is one of them. So thank you both for your service, and thanks for praying for me all those years. Sharon, I can remember 3 hours a day, year after year after year, and I thank the Lord. I don't know how I did it either, but it was by the grace of God, and whom He equips, He obviously empowers. And so now we're 25 years later, and you probably know this. You remember a lot of stuff I was talking about. Well, now it's like it's here. It's now. So if the people that Derek just defined is not even believing the book of Revelation, only the Lord Himself, through miraculous intervention, can kick them up to speed. And I hope tonight that by interviewing you guys on Ebola and the fourth horseman of the apocalypse and the blood serpent, the bottom line is I hope we can lay out for people just the lateness of the hour, and the four horsemen of the apocalypse are not allegorical. They're literally the pronunciation of God's judgment upon the earth before the return of Jesus Christ. So, again, thank you both for being on, and thanks for Derek for bringing me up to speed on Barna Survey. It's heartbreaking, and it's absolutely heart-crushing to think that everything that God has promised us in His Word has been relegated and delegated to some form of ancient words, but no longer practically applied to our lives. And obviously we reject that. And by the grace of God, Hagman and Hagman has provided, Doug's show and Joe's show has provided a marvelous, if you will, foundation for people to hear the Word of God throughout the world, and I'm astonished at the reach. So tonight, Sharon, tonight, Derek, you guys have got literally a world stage, and the world is listening. So again, thank you for both coming on. And So let's get right to the matter, because in the later part of the show we want to get into transhumanism, singularity, and as you guys are working on, your book too, the cyber gods. But it all is related, and then that's what's fascinating. So, why do you call Ebola the blood serpent?
Well, you know what? When microscope experts, that's a hard word for me to say. Let me come in again. Microscopy experts take a look at viruses. They usually see spherical shapes. Sometimes they'll be rod-shaped. But the curious thing about Filoviridae, the family that Ebola, Marburg, and Quavivirus belong to, these have a curvilinear shape. In other words, they're mostly straight, a little bit wiggly, and there at the very end, there's either a curve that looks sort of like a hook, or a sort of like a Cheerio. Sometimes it's called an eyebolt look. And when these microscope experts take a look and they realize what they're seeing, very often what they will shout is, "We've got snakes." So that's one of the reasons I refer to it as the blood serpent. This is a virus that often evinces a hemorrhagic fever response in the body. Not always, which is one of the reasons that we're told that the name of the disease that is engendered by Ebola has changed. The ICD-10 name of the disease is no longer Ebola hemorrhagic fever. Beginning in the early part of this year, the World Health Organization changed the name to Ebola virus disease. So it's almost like they're trying to downplay the hemorrhagic fever part of it, the blood part of it, but it is a virus that seems to want to pour our own blood out as if it's a sacrifice.
Absolutely, and you've nailed it. If the life is in the blood, it's kind of like, and I think it's interesting, I think it's kind of like the footprint or boot print of the cloven hoofed one, another name for the devil, literally taking the creation of Almighty God, in which the life is in the blood, and through redemption we're redeemed. And I think it's so fitting that you would call it that. As a matter of fact, I didn't know you were calling it the blood serpent, and then of course it clicked. And through history, all of the sacrifices, the snake cults being, I write about all that stuff, as you know, being the oldest form of worship in the world prior to God making himself known to Abraham, and prior to that which may have been on earth as the watchers who still maintained the faith in the living God. But we're talking about something that's very interesting. I maintain, and I want your feedback on this, that when I saw no blood and I saw the protocols, I mean, you're a microbiologist. You know you don't go into a biosafety level 4 environment with the haphazard way this whole thing was handled. So do you believe that the redesignation of Ebola virus disease, or the EVD or EBD or whatever they're calling it now, was basically to cover the 360 variations that the CDC holds patents for? I maintain it's a biological weapon, and it is not the Ebola virus. It's not the Filoviridae that we're familiar with in Richard Preston's The Hot Zone, or Laurie Garrett's The Coming Plague, or any of the historic presentations of it. And I also want to get your take on that, because it seems, Sharon, like not only with the announcement of these new variant forms of Ebola-like diseases, that also the fact that there would be vaccines patented already, that's got to be the biggest heads up. What does that say to you as a microbiologist? To me, it's got to have a flagrant statement attached to it.
One of the most disturbing aspects of the current epidemic for me, and the way that it's being discussed by WHO and the CDC, is that it does seem like this is a different type of Ebola than we saw in Eastern Africa, in Zaire and Sudan and Uganda in the 1970s and 80s. We do know that, I mean, it's documented that in 1976 when Ebola and Marburg, actually Marburg I think was in 72, but when those two emerged in the Zaire region, the Russians were seen and reported to be in the hospitals and in the tribal areas trying to get samples of the disease. And if you've ever read Biohazard by Ken Allebeck, and if you haven't, you really need to read it. He was part of he came out of Russia. He was part of the bioterrorism unit that was still operating despite Russia having signed the 1972 Biological Reforms Act or treaty saying that we would no longer be a part of that. We would no longer create biological weapons. Well, the fact is that Russia and the United States were the only two signatories to that treaty that were allowed to keep them. And the reason being given was that, if anybody ever actually weaponizes these and we don't know about it, we need to have vaccines for them. So in 1976, when Russia was in there grabbing pieces of Ebola and taking it back to their labs, Ken Allebeck admits in Biohazard that they were looking at Ebola to weaponize it. So if they were doing it, is it possible we were doing it with the idea, and I'll play, the advocate trying to say, okay, let's just pretend that the government really does have our best interests at heart. I say that tongue-in-cheek, but what if they did, and they were simply trying to make sure that a future weaponization already had vaccines in place? Well, the irony, of course, about vaccines in place is that you can't vaccinate against a mutated disease. You have to see the disease before you can create the vaccine, and yet we've got these vaccines in place for something that appears to be a whole lot different than traditional Ebola, even though we are told this is Ebola Zaire that is taken off in West Africa.
Well, and given the fact that, as you know, Ken Allebeck was with BioPreparat, and he defected, and I remember, Sharon, seriously, and Derek, I remember watching the hearings and some of the transcripts, and he said, look, the Soviet Union at that time, Russia now, succeeded in combining Ebola and smallpox. You remember that? And you know what the senators and congressmen did? They basically received it with just snickers, jeers, and because they were told by the liars in our bioweapons department that's not possible. Well, you and I both know, and Doug, you know, that when they deny something, they only deny it because it already exists.
Yeah, it is in fact possible. They managed to do it with variola, vaccinia, which is the milder form of that type of virus that has been used for decades to vaccinate against smallpox. And the whole point was to eventually use that location in vaccinia to use it for smallpox, combining Ebola with smallpox. And here's the thing, the way that smallpox presents, it's a hemorrhagic event in many cases. So how would you know, just looking at it, that it's Ebola or black pox, which is the hemorrhagic form of smallpox?
Does it bother you, too, Sharon, that there's no independent verification of the true Ebola? In essence, we were told the lies immediately from the CDC that they didn't have tests, and the military, I was told years ago, has a 30-minute test for just about everything that exists. Now there's even a company that had the first basically drop and smear test for AIDS that they've got it down to 1 minute, working on a 1-minute Ebola test. But as a biologist and one who's familiar with molecular, the whole, if you will, configurations of these different things, does it not surprise you that even the basic protocols, I mean, when you, as a microbiologist, go into a laboratory, you don't go in there with basically an N95 respirator, goggles, and, a Tyvek suit. Explain to people the pathogenic nature of a BSL-4 virus or weapon. I mean, this is the most deadly stuff in the world. Is that honest? Is that true?
That's exactly true. And the scientists who, I have never had to work with a BSL-4 pathogen. I praise God for that. But those brave men and women who do put their lives on the line every day working with these diseases, they are suited up like astronauts. They have, face shields that allow them to see what's going on, but totally covers them from head to neck. Below that, they've got a positive pressure suit. It's not a TVEC suit. It's a positive pressure suit that can be hosed off with bleach solution as needed. They have to make sure that they go in with a buddy. They have to make sure that every part of their suit is intact, that they have not one tiny tear, because the Ebola virus and many of these pathogens are tiny. They can make their way through those N95 mask filters. They are so small and so insidious. In fact, Ebola only needs about 5 to 10 virion particles to infect you.
And so what we're saying here is that we're talking about, these are my words, but you just, I guess you say validated, we're talking about the most deadly, the most virulent, the most absolutely life-threatening viruses or biological entities that there are. And yet, did it surprise you to see literally the haphazard nature of no quarantine, no isolation? I mean, every broken protocol was put into place.
Yeah, I just think it's been crazy the way the CDC has been handling it. Have you ever seen the movie And the Band Played On?
Yes.
It's. I tell you what, listeners, if you have not seen that movie, add that and the book Biohazard to your to-do list, because the movie is all about the AIDS epidemic and how it originally started here in the United States, but more importantly, how it was handled by the CDC. The CDC is a political animal. If you think it's here to keep you healthy, then you're mistaken. It is a political arm of the government. So the CDC head has to answer to the administration. He's concerned about getting money. He wants to make sure that the funding is always going to be there. So when Tom Frieden comes out right after Ebola hits in West Africa and begins telling us that it's not airborne, it's these things, you can hardly catch it, you really have to be around all of these things. And we are finding out what you and I have known for a long time, especially if you've read anything about the disease itself, that he was lying.
Well, at this point, nothing they say is true, nothing they've said is accurate, and nothing they propose, and especially, let me just get to the, you know me, I like to read the back of the book first and jump forward and then go back and fill in the meat. I've told Tom, I've always said to Tom, give everybody the bottom line, and then you can tell how you arrived at it. So the point is that that I guess I want you to address, that seeing the nature of the handling, would you, and I know the answer, it's rhetorical, ladies and gentlemen, of course I know her answer, and would you allow your husband, or do you think he'd allow would you guys take a vaccine that is basically based on lies, no transparency, no independent verification or validation, or even lab results to prove it really works?
Oh, goodness, no. And Derek's shaking his head. I wouldn't take any vaccine that they would have to force me to do it.
Do you believe that's the reason, too? Do you believe that's the reason that the vaccines are already in existence? And could this be an elaborate hoax? Now, I want to make it clear. I believe that there is a knockoff variation with some similarity to Ebola. I do not believe it's any of the filoviridae that we're used to, the ones, and if you remember when Ebola first came out, it had an 88% lethal rate. I mean, that's the percentage of people that died. But do you believe the whole thing is designed, as you've thought about this, and obviously as you've written your book, we'll get back to that really quick, but do you think it's designed to push people into kind of a Hegelian medical hell? They create a problem, they basically provide the solution, and they ultimately bring about everybody's death because, you have written and you write and you speak and you talk on the radio, you guys, and this is basically New World Order 101 basics, and are they rubbing our noses in it?
We wouldn't even do that to our own dog. We're going to both answer this, but I'll start off. I think your idea of this being a Hegelian dialectic problem that we're being faced with is accurate. the virus does appear to be very different from the traditional Ebola virus that was discovered in 1976. Now, things can mutate. Viruses very commonly mutate from host to host. But the thing about Ebola is it's not in the host long enough to really do a whole lot of mutating. The response here in the United States plays out like a badly written script. It's very much like Stephen King's The Stand. You know, the early on, and Stand, by the way, if you haven't read the book, begins with an accidental release of a pathogen that has been developed by the military. I will get into what's going on in West Africa and why that is important, that we remember that little bit of fact in a little while, but the response here couldn't have been scripted any worse. I mean, the very idea that you can come in from another country as a doctor and not quarantine yourself, knowing how infectious this disease is. I am shocked that the CDC hasn't sanctioned these doctors, that the AMA hasn't sanctioned these doctors who have shown up here. I'm talking about Craig Spencer and also the doctor from NBC. What was her name?
The senior medical reporter.
Senior science. I just cannot believe Soup Lady decided that she was going to break quarantine. I can't believe that Casey Hickox, the nurse, who we are told took care of patients in West Africa, that she was so thoughtless and cared so little about human health that she would break the very first law of the Hippocratic Oath, first do no harm. In her behavior, she could very well have infected many, many people. And not only did she behave like someone who didn't care about other people, but she sued 2 states to make sure that the quarantine idea was cemented in my mind and yours as being against our civil rights.
And it was Nancy Snyderman, is the name we were trying to remember, senior medical reporter for NBC, who should have known better, and basically dressed up in a way so that she was not immediately recognizable, so she could go out and get a bowl of soup at her favorite restaurant. I look at this, and this is not my area of expertise, but I look elsewhere when the media tries to convince us that we're supposed to focus on one particular story.
That's right.
And I note that you mentioned Laurie Garrett earlier in the program, Steve. Laurie Garrett wrote a column for Foreign Policy not long ago. And besides being the Pulitzer Prize-winning science writer, she's also a senior fellow for global health at the Council on Foreign Relations.
Ooh.
And
right, I read that too, Derek. Yep, I read that too.
October 1st, Obamacare may hold the key to saving the U.S. from Ebola.
Mm-hmm.
I would suggest that Ebola may hold the key to saving Obamacare for the U.S.
Exactly.
Because the point of her article was that there are some 43 million uninsured Americans out there, and they are a significant vulnerability in trying to contain the disease. I would suggest that scaring those 43 million people, plus everyone else who's out there complaining about having to be a part of the system, that Obamacare is a sure way to get your vaccine if the disease spreads, is one way to guarantee that we wind up in a single-payer healthcare system.
And let's not forget that the Supreme Court has agreed to take a look at a lawsuit that is essentially saying that states that have opted out, and there are 34 states that have opted out of the ACA, the Obamacare Act, they have decided they don't want to be any part of it, didn't set up any kind of exchanges, and yet federal money is going to the people who live in that state to subsidize their premiums. That is really illegal. That's against the whole idea of separation of the states and the federal powers. That is, is it the 14th Amendment? What's the amendment that talks about states' rights? Steve, you would probably know that a whole lot better than I. I'm not that great at the Constitution.
Right.
But this is going to be a question, and I think they're addressing it early next year. So when the Supreme Court takes a look at this, and they say, oh, you're right, states can't, the federal government can't do this. People who are suddenly forced to pay 3-4 times the premium will go crazy. They'll drop off the rolls, and then the second wave of Ebola will hit.
Given the fact that, too, the report, Derek, that you're speaking to, did you notice the dig that Lori Garrett made against the alternate media that was saying anything different than the official line. That's the thing that picked up, obviously raised my hackles. I thought, good Lord, talk about a hypocrite, and I will say this publicly. She's the one that warned about it, yet when the CDC was infamously, and I believe, following orders to put the maximum amount of people in maximum harm's way, the only people telling the truth, as we are tonight, and unfortunately she can't argue with you, Sharon, because you've got the credentials, but Derek, did that not surprise you that her dig was so, I would say, almost, here we go, venomous?
Well, that and the fact that she was spreading information that is demonstrably untrue, where she states in the article that the unsubstantiated concerns kicked off by the Texas case include false claims that the virus was spread through the air between monkeys housed in talking about the case in Reston, Virginia.
I know, but that was proven to be true.
Exactly right. She's spreading misinformation.
Exactly.
Yeah, I was stunned.
I was stunned too, but it was a shot across the bow because, again, most people, tonight they'll get more truth, and I'm saying this not because that it's us, but the bottom line is they'll get truth because we're dedicated, you guys have dedicated your lives to the Lord Jesus Christ, and this is the thing that's amazing. I quote the scripture, I'm sure you do too, that God's people are destroyed for lack of knowledge, not because the knowledge isn't presented, but they choose to reject it. In Tom's introduction to your book, Sharon, I like what he said. Basically, the pastors are passing out candy, and they're sugarcoating the truth and reality. So, again, I couldn't agree more with Tom, but I think the point being they're sugarcoating, let's just say this, a cyanide popsicle. And we used to laugh at the Kool-Aid, not laugh, but it was unbelievable to most that any sane person would drink Kool-Aid at the Jonestown massacre, yet the bottom line is they're giving us basically sugar-coated cyanide or something worse. Wouldn't you agree?
I do agree with you, Steve. I do, and I think that one of the most disturbing memes that we're seeing percolating out over and over again, almost like it's talking points. We heard it first from Tom Frieden, and we're hearing it repeated over and over again. This is the new AIDS. This is the new HIV, which means that we're going to have long history with it. And it's going to cause people to shun you, which is, hatred. If you dared to shun someone who has possibly been to West Africa and you're concerned that you might catch it, why, that's violating that person's civil rights. I think we're going to see all kinds of crazy talk.
Yeah, and it's interesting that just after the Lori Garrett article appeared in Foreign Policy, the head of CIDRAP, the Center for Infectious Disease Research and Policy, Michael Osterholm, came out and publicly said, they've been telling us not to spread this information because they don't want us to spread fear. But the fact is, yeah, you can spread it through the air. I mean, it may not be literally aerosolized like the virus is suspended in air like dust particles, but just as with a cold virus or a flu virus, when you sneeze,
it's in the droplets, in the sputum that you're
exactly
sneezing out. Well, in Osterholm's speech to the Johns Hopkins group, he said that the one of the main complaints about the study that indicates very strongly, and it's been repeated, that you can catch Ebola through the air, at least macaque monkeys can. He says, well, they said it's not really in the air. They're not really catching it that way. It's that the handlers come in and there is excrement on the floor, and when they clean, it gets into the air, and so it gets into the monkey's lungs. That is worse. That is true aerosolized virus. That's not in sputum. That is actually riding on an air current.
One of the most important things that when I wrote my book years ago, and you guys were listening to me in those days when I wrote Breathe No Evil, and trying to let people understand, what most people don't address is the bioweaponization or the encapsulation of what I would call the host virus. I even had one time when I did, and you'll appreciate this, the brother of the astronaut who died in the Challenger mishap, he called me. He's a very famous molecular biologist, and he also is one of the guys that figured out how to make anthrax into a bioweapon, but it's called bioencapsulation. Remember that whole thing, you guys, when anthrax came out? Well, if you go to the... I'm sorry?
Oh, I just said very much. Yeah, I do remember.
Yeah, and so here's the context. There have been maybe, I don't know, a half a dozen or so articles, a lot of criticism of some of the stuff I've been saying on the radio, but I actually talked to some of these bioweaponeers, okay, and there's a whole different world. When I started cataloging, and this is to give you, basically the area I want you to address, Sharon, when I started talking to these guys and started noticing who was getting whacked in the Dead Scientist almost 20 years ago, and these were not, like one of my critics said, well, these are university-level microbiologists, molecular biologists, geneticists. I said, are you kidding me? Do a basic Wikipedia search on Bernard Schwartz. Do a search on Boris Pashnik or any of these people. These are the quintessential bioweaponeers. So here's where I want to bring it forward. Do you remember the movie Outbreak with Dustin Hoffman?
Oh, yeah.
That opening scene was real. And I want to ask you both, and I'll share this, Derek, and aim it at you. Did it not surprise you or maybe give you a heads up when Ron Klain was basically, or maybe they pronounce his name Klein, K-L-A-I-N, was appointed the Ebola czar, and he's one of the leading eugenicists in the world who's absolutely dedicated his entire life. By the way, he worked for Janet Reno. That ought to tell you something. But he basically says the world has too many people. And so with all of the death to humanity, and this will spring us into the next subject when we get there, but the death to humanity, does that not say something? And is it even not more interesting that he was quiet during this thing? Maybe someone told him to stand down. But look, when you start adding 2 and 2, I don't care about the new math. I don't care about core teaching. I care about reality. And the fact that the Ebola czar is absent, but if you go and read what he's written, he's in favor of the global depopulation. What are your thoughts on that, Derek?
Well, it didn't really surprise me much because most of the people connected to the Obama administration, his science czar, John Holdren, is the same, holds the same worldview. So I think it's just a case of somebody, elevating somebody with whom he's comfortable because they all hold that similar worldview. The biggest problem with the world is that there are too many of us useless eaters out here. That didn't surprise me at all. The other thing that didn't surprise me was that they elevated somebody whose expertise is in managing the press. He's a very skilled
former lobbyist,
a Democratic Party operative who has served as chief of staff for 2 United States vice presidents, Biden and Gore. And I don't think it's a coincidence that Ebola more or less dropped out of the mainstream media, even Fox News, after Klain was named to this position. They basically got the mainstream media to shut up about it, even though, and I don't have the exact number, but this is a little closer to Hagman's backyard, that in New Jersey, New York, there are several hundred people who are being watched now because they're still within the 21-day window and had recently been exposed to Ebola. But you don't hear about that on the news because somebody behind the scenes has made a few phone calls.
Mm-hmm.
And
well,
did you see the story about Ron Klain a few days ago saying that when he accepted the job as Ebola czar, it was probably because he was going to get a better job very quickly? He's in line to succeed John Podesta as counselor to Obama.
Wow. Doug.
Yeah, if I can interject something here, because we're getting a lot of emails to our studio. Something that was kind of touched on but not really explained, and we've got listeners asking about this. Derek, you touched on this a touch. There are people under surveillance, medical surveillance, for the signs of Ebola here in the tri-state area in New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. But however, a lot of people want to know, given the potential behind this Ebola in terms of it spreading, why aren't we not seeing more people contracting Ebola, especially, for example, the family of Duncan and the doctors, and the big story with that doctor going bowling and such. Why are we not seeing more infectious reports of infections, Ebola infection?
Well, do you mind if I jump in on that? I know you'd ask Derek about it, but that's been one of my major questions. Where is Louise Tro and her family? We've been told by her pastor that she and her family returned to church after they were released from quarantine, wherever they were being held. And, we were told they were in a gated community. Oh, yeah, well, maybe. But they're supposedly back in the church, back in the fold, being hugged by everybody. And yet she's not gone, to my knowledge, she's not gone on the record personally. She's not given interviews. We've not really, anybody else would have been in the news, the press constantly over that. Just the miracle that she survived, and because they were in that apartment for days with his sheets, with his, with having to clean up personally from his vomit. He vomited right before he got in the car to go to the hospital. Derek, did you want to jump in?
Yep.
Well, no, this is really an area that you've been tracking a lot more closely than I have. So,
well, I'm really shocked. We're right now, I think there are probably about 500 people across the United States, depending on the various reports, who are being watched, being told to self-monitor. We were told by the CDC that when somebody came back from West Africa or someone had the potential to contract Ebola or apparently was carrying Ebola or had been exposed to Ebola, that they would be given these little kits, and that they would be tracked from the airport. They'd be given these little kits to take home and make sure you take your temperature every day. Well, you know what? If I were a person that was trying to hide, I didn't think I would report back in. So self-monitoring doesn't really work all that well. But you're right. Where are the other cases of Ebola? Why didn't Louise Tro contract Ebola? Why didn't some of her family contract Ebola? Why didn't I think it's his niece, who was the one who actually helped him into the car, drove him to the hospital, stood by him as he was, expelling vomit all over, probably her as well, because when you vomit, it looks like, or when you sneeze, it looks like it's pretty contained. But if you were able to look at that in slow motion, you would see little particles going for 10 feet.
Exactly. Well, and Steve, I'll toss it back to you. Go ahead.
Well, no. And I think that's the thing. The carelessness in handling bodily waste and everything was also a heads up. I want to make it clear, this is not Ebola historic. This is not a hemorrhagic fever. This is nothing historically related. So how do you and I, Sharon, and basically as a scientist, wouldn't you want to see a true test? Wouldn't you want to see independent confirmation? Because quite candidly, you remember the lies we were told about how long it takes to get a positive Ebola? And then let's talk. As a microbiologist, what does it mean to get a false positive?
Well, you can get false negatives early on. In fact,
right.
It's not uncommon at all early in the disease, after you've been exposed maybe a few days, a week, to take a test and actually have a false negative, because the incubation period can be up to 21 days and even longer. The World Health Organization recently changed it to 42 days. They say you have to go 42 days without a case to be declared a state that is Ebola-free. So what do they know that we don't know?
By false positive, I mean that they're claiming that it's Ebola, but there's no verification. There's no validation.
That's a good point.
That's what I'm saying.
That's a very good point. And I'd say that's very possible. And is this indeed Zaire Ebola? Is this the disease that killed so many, as much as 90% lethality in Zaire? Is this, and we're told it is, but we're also told that it differs by about 320 bases. That's a lot in a small RNA genome. That is a lot. So if they're being honest about the sequencing of the disease, of the pathogen, is it possible this is bioengineered in some way? And that it
I believe it. Yeah, I believe it is. And I can only share this because they can't. I'm sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say, and what I'm saying over and over again, this is the new AIDS, this is the new HIV. is this something that they're trying to say it's may even be a sleeper virus that sticks with you for a long time and gives you a different sort of symptomatic response to the disease? I honestly don't know where they were going with this, but I do know, and we'll get to this in a minute, that the United States through USAMRIID, Fort Detrick, and also Tulane University were doing experiments in West Africa prior to the outbreak.
We have labs there. And interestingly enough, the only one that seems to be really up on it, I forget if it's a Liberian Times or whatever their newspaper is, they know exactly. They've traced the actual, some of the medical professionals down there have traced the actual people that are dying from this. They've traced it to vaccination. So years ago, and you guys have listened to me on the radio, and this is critical, Doug, years ago, I couldn't know what I know unless the Lord was faithful to bring the people that know. But I remember talking to one of the most evil men I've ever met in my life, and I've talked about him on the radio before. But he said this, and this, you guys, will blow your mind. He said, Africa is a test tube, and when our experiments get out of hand, we send in the fuel air explosives. He then brought up outbreak. He said, who do you think gave that to Hollywood, how to deal with that? And obviously, we know the answer to that. And Donald Sutherland's character in Outbreak is obviously the guy that's getting ready to torch the whole area, if you remember the story, and it's a race against time. But why I'm saying that, Sharon, Derek, Doug, and Joe, is the fact that there is no transparency, there is no independent validation or verification. We're being told it's one thing, and then we're told, and again, I didn't know this, but as you guys know, and I've learned this since, that you cannot patent a natural occurring virus, but you can patent all forms that are derived off there. All mutagenic products can be patented and can be claimed as intellectual property. Knowing that, Sharon Gilbert, did that not come as a surprise even to you that they were bragging about having basically a variation of Ebola? And by the way, that's what bioweaponeers do for every day of the week, so to speak, and then to have the vaccines uniquely in place and in play?
I think one of the troubling parts of it for me is not only the patenting, stories that we've seen coming out, but the vaccines. They've been in play now. They've been experimenting on these vaccines for about 10 years. And in the last 5 years, many of the companies and research projects have been moving toward that human trial phase, the phase 1 clinical trials. And they haven't been able to get permission to do it. The other thing about Ebola, traditional Ebola, is that therapeutics for that really don't get you a whole lot of money because it's traditionally been something that outbreaks in very poor regions, very poor countries. They can't afford to give a pharmaceutical house a whole lot of money for something that took a long time to research. A lot of money's gone into these vaccines. So who's going to make the money? Follow the money.
Well, I think it's obvious that when you see outspoken globalists who are basically the most pronounced people on population control and destruction, owning patents and putting up money, then you've got to understand. Did you see the new revelation too of in Africa the tetanus shots are laced with anti-fertility substances? Did you see that? That broke last week.
In fact, I'm glad you brought that up. I was going to bring that up as well. Yeah, it's been proven through tests that the vaccine for tetanus actually contains human chorionic gonadotropin, which is a hormone that is required during early pregnancy. Every woman who ovulates secretes HCG, and if she doesn't become pregnant, it just goes away and the egg is destroyed. If she becomes pregnant, HCG continues to be secreted for 3 months until she is safely past the what am I trying to say? The not abortion, but the miscarriage stage. because if you don't have HCG, that's one of the reasons that, one of the primary reasons for infertility in the United States is that women don't properly secrete HCG. Now, if they're doing that over there, and the reason that it's bad is because if you're injected with HCG, you see that as an invader. Your body mounts an immune response against that. So the next time it sees HCG, it's going to destroy it, which is why it's a form of population control.
If they've never told the truth in the past, if they're lying in the present, and everybody is uniquely silent. By the way, did you follow, too, prior to the outbreak of Ebola, first, openly in this country in the announcement, do you remember the CDC mass, not firings, but where they basically, a lot of the head doctors quit? Mass resignation, that's a word I'm looking for. Did you notice that?
Yes, I did, and this happened at about the same time that we had the HHS and, not the HHS, but the Howard Hughes Institute, HHI, and National Institutes of Health and the CDC suddenly discovering pathogens that had been stored in a closet or in a hallway. Yeah. Oh, we didn't know the smallpox vaccine was here. We didn't know this was here.
Accidentally
so what all did they find, for goodness sake? Were these sort of floated out there as just-in-case excuses before the fact?
Well,
totally bogus. Derek, were you going to say something?
Just the hubris of some of the researchers is another factor to consider, too, that the researcher at the University of Wisconsin-Madison who recreated the Spanish flu virus of 1918-1919 for the purpose of research to determine to try to develop a potential response against someone else who might try to weaponize it. Couple that with the carelessness with which some of these pathogens are treated, and the fact that some of these that were discovered after they had been sent by accident to laboratories that weren't equipped to handle pathogens as dangerous as the ones they received.
Yeah.
So which kind of begs the question, how did this outbreak in West Africa develop to begin with? All previous outbreaks, and this was something Sharon picked up on very early on, when it first hit the news very quietly back last December.
December of last year.
Right, which was several months before the official date we are given for the outbreak. When she noticed very quickly, hey, this is in West Africa. This is not in Congo, which is Central Africa, which is where it normally flares up. Now, most of us here in the West, we know so little about geography outside of our own neighborhoods, much less on the other side of the ocean. We think, well, Africa is Africa, no big deal. But when you actually look at a map and start stretching out a ruler on a map and then convert that into actual miles and see how far Sierra Leone, Guinea, and Liberia are from Congo, it is a long, long way. And right now, they really don't have a good explanation for how it got there. They theorize, well, maybe a bat that was infected flew from Congo but they don't know, because they don't really know that bats have that migratory pattern. They don't know how it got there.
Maybe it didn't get there.
Or they say,
yeah, hey, Derek, maybe it didn't get there. The bottom line is, does it make it a little more curious? Let's use that word. It's more curious that there are bioweapons labs in the area that basically it broke out in. In other words, you remember, is it Crimean Congo hemorrhagic fever, or is it Congo Crimean CCHF, Sharon?
Crimean Congo.
Okay, so we're talking about CCHF, which is hemorrhagic. Would you explain to everybody what the word hemorrhagic means? And I'm not trying to make it, but I mean, again, the newspaper and the press and the controlled mouthpieces of the, my definition of mainstream press are vomit brokers. Okay, how appropriate. The point is that they don't even explain a simple word like hemorrhagic. They get the, if you will, they use it, but they don't explain it. Explain to people why there should be more blood, and there isn't. There's no blood signature as there would be and as there has been historically. Please explain that.
Classic hemorrhagic fever response is that your endothelial cells are attacked and they break down. Those line your blood vessels, and when those break down, and also some of your organs, and when those break down, then blood can seep out. You can end up with something like Ebola, or even with, as I talked about earlier, blackpox, the hemorrhagic version of smallpox. You can end up with blood pooling so much underneath your skin that your skin sloughs off. I mean, this is something that you just bleed out. You bleed from your eyes, from your ears, from your nose. Your sputum contains blood. Your vomit contains blood. Your excrement contains blood. Every orifice is spewing out blood. And anytime somebody tries to give you a shot of morphine for the pain or whatever therapeutics they're using that require an injection, blood spews out of that as well.
So it's a very significant signature when you're dealing with a true hemorrhagic fever. And
exactly.
Again,
I wonder why they
outside of the vomit. Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh, it just makes you wonder, is that the real reason they've changed it to EVD in the ICD-10, which, if you're unfamiliar, your listeners, I'm betting if they've been listening to you that they know what the ICD-10, ICD-9 from previous years is. It's essentially the military's coding for diseases. So the new ICD-10 calls it EVD, Ebola virus disease. They've taken the word hemorrhagic out.
Right, and that's why, and so they've done it because, again, the point being is you would not be so, good word here, helter-skelter in your approach, or I would say dumb donkey ignorant. In a true hemorrhagic environment, everybody who would even be in that neighborhood with 90% death, 9 out of 10 people would be dead. Saying that, then could this be, in one respect, the biggest, when I say hoax, I don't mean people aren't dying, okay? But absolute misapplication of all microbiological and molecular biological terms to absolutely pull it over on the American public. And Doug, do we have to take a break now, or let's take our break and then we'll let Sharon pick up. But that's the question. Is this a hoax? Is this a sleight of hand to basically force vaccination? Is that the end game? Go ahead, Doug.